Hello, and welcome, and thank you for coming. So my name is Tom Walker, and I teach here in the School of English. And I'm going to be introducing and chairing today's session. It's the latest in a series of events on the topic of Trinity and the Changing City that is being run here at the Hub by the college's Identities in Transformation research team. This is a theme, a group of scholars drawn from across the arts, humanities and social sciences, whose research considers from a variety of perspectives how identities at both the individual and the collective level are formed, developed and negotiated across history, culture and society. One of the issues that this series on Trinity and the Changing City was set up to examine and interrogate, I suppose, was the way in which certain changes within the city of Dublin and their relationship to questions of poverty, health, housing and governmental policy have not generally been well represented in the media or in public discourse. There also, generally speaking, seems to be a representative gap between the city in which Trinity resides, not least in terms of language, race and class, and the images and narratives of that city put forth in the broader culture. So today's session on Seeing Other Dublins is an attempt to consider the challenge of representing the parts and people of the city who often seem to elude the way in which the city is more generally represented and mediated. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce our three speakers tonight who are speaking in and around this topic. I'll introduce them each individually in turn just before they speak. They'll each speak to the topic for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor to questions and to further discussion. Let me introduce our first speaker, Paula Meehan. Paula Meehan is one of Ireland's most distinguished contemporary poets, born and brought up in Dublin, in the North Inner City and in Finglas, and a former student of Trinity, as well as of Eastern Washington University in the United States. Paula has published 6 collections of poetry, including most recently Geomantic, which came out last year from the Deedless Press. She's also written several plays for the stage and for radio, and received numerous awards, including the Dennis Devlin Memorial Award and the PPI Award for radio drama. She's a member of Oshtana and was from 2013 until 2016 the Ireland Chair of Poetry, during which time she gave 3 fascinating lectures that were then published under the wonderful title Imaginary Bonnets with Real Bees in Them. So without further ado, Paula Meehan.
Thanks very much, Tom, for inviting me along tonight. And I'm just going to really have a look at an early poem and then read a more recent poem. In 2014, I was invited back to my primary school, the Central Model Girls' School, at the back of the Department of Education in Marlborough Street, and we would use the entrance off Gardner Street. So I went back to the school as I was introduced as a famous old girl. And when I walked in, the students had been working with a poem of mine called Buying Wrinkles, and the poem is set around 1963 or so, when I'm about 8 years of age, and I'm allowed to go out of our 3rd floor flat on the corner of Sean McDermott Street and Gardner Street up to the corner to buy Wrinkles from a street seller outside the pub. And that woman would have been one of the old Shawleys. To me, she was an ancient person in her black shawl, and she would have gone out to the coast and collected periwinkles off the rocks, brought them home in buckets, boiled them up, and then sold them at the pub corner for literally pin money, because you needed a pin to get the winkle out. Have all of you eaten Wrinkles? Yes. No? Do you know what they are? What they look like? They're like hard-shelled snails, and you harvest them from the rocks at low water tide. Anyway, I went back to the school and there were Wrinkles everywhere. There were pictures of Wrinkles, there were papier-mâché Wrinkles, there were studies of the life cycle of Wrinkles. I was visiting the 12-year-olds in the class, and when I was leaving they presented me with this book here. And it's the Central Model Senior School. They no longer have girls' schools, boys' schools and junior infants. They're all in it together. And I'm in there. They're all as tall as me. They're the new tall people. 6th class poetry, childhood memories. Okay, so they used my little poem about buying Wrinkles as a child to write their own childhood memories. I'll just run you through the names of the children in that class, 6th class. They'll all be, by now, 4 years later, you would hope, in secondary school somewhere or in community colleges. But here are some of the names: Tushar, Syrian, Arek, Devon, Sergiu, Dylan, a nod to our great Nobel laureate, Jaya, Faina, another Dylan, and another nod to our great Nobel laureate, Luca, Chantel, Paula, Darius, Malgosia, Maria, Octavia, Nicola, Presley, Francis, Renee, Xenge, Dylan. 3 bows of gratitude to our great Nobel laureate. And Tia Ryan, an Indigenous dub. Okay, so I'm going to read the little poem that Tia Ryan put in this book of marvellous poems that includes a Polish boy going out remote to his grandmother's village and getting the eggs from under the hen, the warm eggs, things that many Irish children would experience. A Nigerian girl's memory of going through the markets to buy spices in her village. So all these memories brought by 12-year-olds into that classroom just totally not only moved me, but kind of galvanized me around the whole idea of what poetry does and how it's transmitted and what is fossilized in poetry, if you like, in a way, or what is preserved in poetry, like flies or petals in amber. So this is a little poem by one of the few, what I would call Indigenous Dubliners, if there's such a thing, and it's called Flower Stall by Tia Ryan. Her mother was a street seller, her grandmother was a street seller before her. Get your bunches, 1 for a tenner, selling flowers on Henry Street, me and my ma, with thorns in our hands, coins rattling in our pockets, and the smell of roses in the air. So the small poem that they had worked so diligently with, had painted and made images of and explored, is a poem called Buying Wrinkles, and it is really my childhood fossilized in this poem. I didn't write it to represent anything other than my own urge to represent my memory and my life. It was written as an adult, remembering a childhood, so it's highly manipulated material. I actually would have had a composite old woman selling Wrinkles. Many years after I wrote this poem, I worked in the prisons, and one young man seemed very agitated during a reading. I went in to do a reading that day, and it turned out that he recognised his grandmother in this old woman. And one of the things I discovered in the prisons was that if you were to have any address in Dublin and be a prisoner, you were more likely to have an address in the communities that I had grown up in than you might have had in other parts of the city. And you were more likely to go into that institution than you were to come to this institution, more of which anon. But this is Buying Wrinkles. My mother would spare me 6pence and say, "Hurry up now and don't be talking to strange men on the way." I'd dash from the ghosts on the stairs where the bulb had blown out into Gardner Street, all relief. A bonus if the moon was in the strip of sky between the tall houses or stars out. But even in rain I was happy. The Wrinkles would be wet and glisten blue like little night skies themselves. I'd hold the tanner tight. I'd jump every crack in the pavement. I'd wave up to women at sills or those lingering in doorways and weave a glad path through men heading out for the night. She'd be sitting outside the Rose Bowl bar on an orange crate, a pram loaded with pails of Wrinkles before her. When the bar door swung open, they'd leak the smell of men together with drink, and I'd see light in golden mirrors. I envied each soul in the hot interior. I'd ask her again to show me the right way to do it. She'd take a pin from her shawl, open the eyelid, stick it in, so, till you feel a grip, then slither him out, gently mind, the sweetest extra Winkle that brought the sea to me. Tell your ma I picked them fresh this morning. I bear the newspaper twists, bulging fat with Winkles, proudly home like torches. As I said, I didn't write that to represent any community. I didn't write it to represent anything other than my own need to express what had formed me. And I think I would be very wary of what I call on behalfism. And I kind of feel that anyone who would ask me to represent them might need their head examined. I'm not a politician. The power I'm after and the power I play with is not political power. So I have no mandate to represent anybody, except maybe going about the world I might represent the spirit of poetry itself, sometimes configured as a muse, as a feminine force. And I can buy into that big time. So, moving to a different time in the process, I wrote this poem called Alma Mater, which kind of was an attempt to integrate, because I think that's maybe why I write, is to integrate disparate material for myself. But what I found is that the truer I am to my own experience, the more likely it is that other people and even communities will actually take ownership of the poems and tell me that I represent them and tell me that the poems represent them. But I think for me to set out in my practice as a writer from that point would be to become, I don't know, maybe even megalomaniac about things. So this is a poem called Alma Mater. One of my great teachers, I've had many in this university where I came in the door at 17, was the classic scholar W.B. Stanford. And he, my very first lecture was on the Greek myths. And he wrote a very small book called Enemies of Poetry, very influential as I got older. And in that book, his thesis was that poetry is not sociology, it's not history, it's a sovereign state unto itself with absolute freedom in the hands of the poet. So I heard that, it was music to my ears. This poem is dedicated to Elaine Cullinan, who is the current Ireland Professor of Poetry. And again, she taught me, in my very first year, she taught me etymology. So she opened up pathways of engagement with the words themselves. Kieran Carson, the Belfast poet, when once asked in an interview, the interviewer said, "Oh, the language." He said that he serves the language. It's not the other way around. The transaction is that he serves. Kieran serves the language, not that the language serves him. So Alma Mater, and just as a point of information, the elms which were cut down when I was in my first few years here, the great elms came down in the 70s, 1972, when I came into the university. Alma Mater. The word comes from the elms. The elm was used as a structure upon which the wild vine could climb. And this one is dedicated to Amelie. They were taking down the elms when I was first a student here. I walked through front gate to sit at the back of Amelie Cullinan's lectures, being a back of the class girl, being a back of the bus girl, being just gone 17 and measuring the teachers who would lead me towards the light against my own inclination to be led astray. They were taking down the elms, concentric rings, the ripples of my life, like the long playing vinyl discs my music was graven on. The whole world rhymed for me, and I wore a dress of green velvet my mother helped me sew. The elm's asymmetric leaves chimed with its pattern of paisley. The song itself was blind courage, the heart's true refrain. Words, said the poet Pasternak, carry their own ghosts. I see them daily in the babble of the city, the weighted down old women with their Geist bags of home, in languages I dreamt of when I was a child, watching satyrs chase nereids and naiads across the snowfields of a tenement ceiling, bordered with panpipes, acanthus and Orphic lyres. I never knew we were disadvantaged till they told us so in school. You could say they beat it into us, literally. We were told we were stupid. I knew we were only poor. But I was queen of every blossoming thing I could name or hazard a guess to the meaning of. Dear ghosts flocking like starlings to the elm branches. At the back of the class, in the month of All Hallows, I heard that galaxy contained the Greek word for milk, gala. I could taste the Milky Way, our cosmic mother, sacramental on my tongue, and tripped the light fantastic into verse, the milk of human kindness, the milk of kinship, the nourishing milk, which brings me back to Alma Mater, nursing mother, fostering mother, close kin to Ceres, close kin to Our Lady, the medievalist's Queen of Heaven, golden chain of memory, link by shining link that binds me to this place, that lets me feel at home, a nursling at the pap of human and non-human knowledge, my nurturing metric, my compassionate mother load. The elms are down, and down their greeny shade, their rugged bark where long-gone students carve their names within a heart, and gone are all the moons and clouds and stars once snagged in their rigging when I was finding my feet and standing on them, my own 2 feet, clad in Doc Martens, clad in sandals, ready to walk the songlines of learning, ready to make an abiding song of home. So thank you for your attention today.
Thank you, Paula. I'm just now going to do fiddle with the computer again, just to get the right slide. Our next speaker is the visual artist Dorothy Smith. She's a graduate of IDT, NCAD and UCD. Her recent exhibitions and projects include the exhibition Landmarks, which was held at the Royal Hibernian Academy earlier this year, Made and Considered, a solo exhibition held in the Dark, the Dublin architectural space in 2016. She's currently in receipt of an Arts Council Engaging with Architecture Award. She's also a member of the Black Church Print Studio and of Visual Arts Ireland, and is a founding member of the Reimagining Phibsborough campaign. She's exhibited widely in solo and group exhibitions and has worked in the collections of the Office of Public Works, the Irish Contemporary Art Society, the National Irish Visual Artists Library, and New York Public Library's print collection, and is also the recipient of the Royal Hibernian Academy's AXA Drawing Prize. So, Dorothy, thank you.
Thank you. How do I change slides?
If you just keyboard.
All right, great.
Use the
Just
arrows.
Thanks. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for the invitation, Tom, to speak here. I'm from Phibsborough. Can you hear me, actually? That's right, yes, okay. Well, I'm not from Phibsborough at all, that's a mistake. I live in Phibsborough, and I say that as it's significant, as it's like my home. It's where I kind of sally forth from every day. So if we were to kind of track on a map our movements through space, like there would be a very dense concentration for me, you know, in Phibsborough, and kind of spreading out and getting kind of thinner and thinner from there. And the reason I tell you this is because what I'm really interested in my work is kind of the everyday experience, and in particular the everyday experience of public space that we all share and inhabit. So by this public space, I'm talking about, you know, it's also called the public realm, and it's kind of a loose, you know, a relatively loose term, but it really is that shared exterior space that we have when we kind of leave the threshold of our homes. And I think, you know, it's shared, this kind of public realm can often be much neglected, but it is of huge importance to the quality and possibilities of our lives. And also within that shared space, of course, is the visual shared space we have and how that impacts on the quality of that public realm. So I'm going to show you some of my drawings. I've grouped them into 4 loose themes. The first one I'm going to show you are, here we go, great, a series of small drawings. I'll tell you the themes first, yeah. Oh yes, a series of small drawings called Other Landscapes. And I'm going to show you some drawings I did over the last year or two. They're all kind of to do with housing and home. And they're going to look at a few drawings to do with kind of sites of construction and new developments. And then the last ones are what I call my transitional sculptural moments that are to be found in our city and our built environments. The title Other Landscapes comes from a book written by Patrick Keeler, who is a British filmmaker and writer, and he had a group of essays published, and it's called A View from the Train, Cities and Other Landscapes. And I had never really put the landscapes and cities together in my mind until this title, so I take the other landscapes very much from that the title of that book. And there was another quote in that book which I've always kept with me since, and it's an Oscar Wilde quote, and it is, "The true mystery of the world is in the visible and not the invisible." So I think what I do with my work is that I ask questions rather about the invisible forces that make something be the way it is. Like, for example, a situation like this. I'm asking questions about, like, why is this like this? What forces have acted on this to create this? So a lot of these other landscapes are they're neglected corners, awkward spaces that might have been formerly planned, but they have kind of had erratic occupation and use over a period of time. This one is kind of a new space in a sense, and it's part of that big, huge investment in roads and motorways and transport for the private car, essentially, that we've really invested heavily in over the last few decades. And like, it's a slip road from the M50 onto to the airport, and it's designed to be passed through and not to linger or stay in any sense. So these spaces, they vary a lot. This one is, this is Dalymount Football Club in Wipster. I'm just wondering, has anyone been to a match there? Is it 1, 2, 3? So it's a really iconic North Dublin and the home of Irish football. But these are the terraces, and you see they're really overgrown, but they were designed by Archibald Leach, who in the early 30s, and he was a really famous engineer who designed many famous soccer grounds in the UK and Dalymount Park. So these are extant from the early 30s, the terracing and the barriers. I could speak a lot about Dalymount because, as Tom mentioned, myself and my friend and colleague Jackie Burke are doing an Arts Council funded project on the whole architectural space and legacy of Dalymount, but I won't go any further because I'll be here all night. But it's a really fascinating and amazing place. But the good news about it, for those that don't know, is that it's been saved from the brink and it's been bought by Dublin City Council and is going to be developed as a municipal sports stadium, which is really good news for the area, and it's good news also for Bohemian Football Club. So this is another type of space, a kind of forgotten pass-by corner. It's the gable of a house, and on that is spray-painted a goals for football. And I really just think this kind of really brings into question the whole how we design our public spaces in terms of the needs of children, teenagers, and how arguably they are designed out of public space, and we don't really like them in public space very much unless they're being very much controlled, and we design this kind of like ghettoed playgrounds for them. But in terms of our, common streets and footpaths, they're really not very welcome. And this is an example of kids trying to adapt their environment to their needs. This is just pretty typical. This is on the Royal Canal, and it's, we all experience this kind of public realm every day. And I drew this last year. No, I drew this earlier this year, actually, I think. No, sorry, I drew it last year. This time last year. And what can I say? The situation is worse now than then. And this was on the banks of the Royal Canal then. So I'm going to show you, so that's the other landscapes. It's an ongoing series looking at those kind of neglected corners and thinking of them in terms of landscapes. So this is kind of different, and it's an earlier drawing that I put in. It's called Island with Cable Ties, and I was talking to Tom about this earlier because we both know it intimately. It's right outside Wipster Shopping Centre. But what I really like, there's lots of things I like about this. One, it's an essential part of public infrastructure that's used all the time, but that is really not noticed or thought about or questioned. And I also find the narrative that it holds fascinating, because at one point there was nothing there, and then there was a platform, and then they painted stripes, and then there was barriers, and then, so it was just added onto and added onto. And it's so not fit for purpose. We were just talking about this, you can't get two people by, etc., etc. But the really great bit is when there's an election and it's festooned with smiling faces of our local would-be and politicians. Okay, so now, just let's see. So I have just a few slides now that really look at the theme of housing and homeless. Not housing and home, there you go. So, but just to say that I don't set out to do a drawing thinking, I want to make a point about something. I don't draw to particular themes at all in any way. It's just kind of when you look back at your work, you can see themes emerge. So I really find drawing for me is a process of exploring the public realm that we share. And really, it's not kind of, I don't kind of construct kind of themes to work to. They really do emerge later. And so I find drawing is a very informative process for me. This is called Fáilte Ireland, Faas, and it was a commission for Gael School Barra, which is in Cabra, and I did that earlier this year as well. And they were 22 years in these porta cabins, waiting for a school, and they finally got their school earlier this year. So this was the headmaster's office, the secretary's office, and the staff room. I was reliably informed this. So that's Gaelscoil Bar, and and so they're in their new school, which is right beside it, but they speak so fondly of this collection of porta cabinets, which is behind Finbar's GAA club on a patch of concrete. And they were there 22 years, but I think, they have this amazing sense of community and warmth about it, and they're in a new building now, and they say they've lost so much in some respects. And so now they kind of, I think, the building, it's your presence in the building and how it affects it, and it's still quite new to them. So that's kind of one kind of a home, and this is another. I call this encounter. And I called it encounter because I passed this building loads of times until one day I was cycling by. It's on the Royal Canal, and I literally stopped me in my tracks, and I kind of stopped and went, "Wow, why have I never seen this before?" So it's at Croke Villas, which is really near Croke Park, and it's part of that big era of public spending on public housing. And it was designed. It was 1956, designed by Dublin. It would have been the Dublin Corporation architect Dolly Hanley at the time. And I went back. I drew this, and it was in the show in the RHA. And I kind of went back to visit it there not long ago, and it's completely gone. So this is being regenerated. This area. So there's 4 blocks. 3 are gone, and 1 will be demolished early in the new year. But what's kind of interesting is, well, a lot of interesting things. To build these in the 50s, there was a compulsory purchase order put on rows of cottages. So they were demolished to build this, and now this is being demolished for our next iteration of housing, which is now going to be a public-private arrangement. And I quote, "If there is going to be a processional boulevard to Croke Park here as well." So this is another. This is on Dorset Street Flats, and this is the stairwell to the flats. And I drew this because I thought it was a really beautiful bit of design. That was why I drew this. But it's also publicly funded design and housing as well. And then the last thing in the whole housing thing that I drew, this is very close to me. And what I really like about this is that it is so ordinary. It's completely not noteworthy. It's a huge part of our architectural heritage, or well, what will be heritage, is this kind of really ordinary housing. And I kind of drew it in reaction to the flats, because this is a private, and it's quiet and ordinary and not political in any obvious way at all. So I'm going to go on to the next one here. So by drawing all these buildings and structures and corners, I suppose what really has come home to me is that buildings have lives, and I would never have thought about them that way. I mean, of course, buildings begin and have a middle and have an end, but they really start to me to be kind of to really have lives, and to be, so they have lives and a life cycle, and the whole city has this life cycle going on, and this ever evolving and changing situation that I wouldn't have been so aware of without engaging in all these drawings. This is kind of like another type of building. It is a 32-story continuous pour concrete tower in the process of being built, and it's on Sir John Rogerson's Quay, and it's in a very prominent site down near where the Grand Canal exits onto the river. It's called Capital and Then Some. So I called it Capital because the developers call the whole dock Capital Dock, which I thought was a kind of an extraordinary name, really. But when I thought about the name, I thought it's an interesting word. It has lots of different meanings, well, a number of different meanings. And the first one that came to mind was the whole flow of capital. and the whole flow of capital that must have gone in to build this. It's a really huge development. And the fact that, you know, international capital really doesn't really have borders in the same way maybe that people have borders. And then the other meaning of capital, of course, is like a capital city. And like big developments like this are really kind of statements that we're a capital city, and it kind of brings home the whole idea of the nation state, which does have borders. So I kind of thought that the word capital there kind of juxtaposes these kind of these two elements together. So this is a capital and then some, and this is capital more is easy, which is taken from an insurance ad. The more is easy. Pities. So capital more is easy. So with development you have demolition, as in with Crook Villas being demolished and replaced. And this is also one of those sculptural moments that I talk about. I just saw this and I actually thought, my God, that is beautiful. That was my real kind of the initial kind of reaction to it. But this is on Molesworth Street, and anyone who's been around Molesworth Street over the last 2 years, it's been phenomenal what's been going on there in terms of the demolition and rebuilding. And if I don't understand the invisible forces that are making that happen, but there's lots of them and they're really strong. And I suppose by drawing these things, I'm trying to get people, I'm drawing them for my own benefit, but they make me think, like, what's going on and why is this way? So this is kind of another, these are all from building sites. This is, I thought this is kind of like a beautiful bit of modern sculpture. It's concrete, wood and stone, lovely and minimal. And when I saw it, what I thought of was the Keystone in Newgrange, the sculptures on the Keystone in Newgrange. And of course these are made from the claw hammer, lifting and dropping this. This is really like a maritime equivalent of the traffic lights, the traffic islands. So these are either side of the Eastlink Bridge. Next time you're going over, look either side, there's at least 8 of them, and they're buffers to stop the ships knocking into the bridge or to tie onto, and they're very like the traffic light, and all these add-ons and signs and lights have all been put on them as well. So I think this is my last drawing here. This was part of the fabulous big public project in Dublin recently of the Lewis, and this is called Underpinning. And this literally is what underpins the Lewis. These are reinforcing bars, but it is one of those kind of sculptural moments. And they're transitional. They're there. They might be there an hour. They might be there a day. They might be there a week. But they're all moving and evolving in this ever-changing city that we're in. There is I do the drawings for myself, and I thought it was interesting that Paula said, you're not representing anyone, and I'm really do them for me, and it's my way of exploring the city and my way of finding out about it and my way of trying to understand what's going on, and it's also me asking questions. It's not me having any answers to this. But the one thing that has made me think, or the one thing that has made me realise really, is that the essence of a city is that it changes. And I'd never really thought of it that way. I was once in a place in Italy that was beautifully restored, and it was never going to change again, and it was a very, very strange place. And I think we don't appreciate that really the essence of the city is this constant changing and evolving. But I think what's important is so there's these invisible forces acting and changing the city all the time, but what really matters is, like, who are the intended beneficiaries of this change? And that really changes over time. If you think of the public spending in the mid-20th century, public houses, the intended beneficiaries are very clear. We think of Crook Villas now and the new spending that's happening there, like, who are the beneficiaries of that? Who are the beneficiaries of this? So I think that's really key in terms of the motivation and the beneficiaries. And one last thing to say. So I spend an awful lot of time doing these drawings, and I really sometimes think, what am I doing? It's so out of step with life, our contemporary life and times. It's so slow, and it's so low tech. I mean, you need, a rubber, a pencil, and paper. And it kind of, in a way, that's the point, I suppose. But you do doubt yourself sometimes, like, what is this doing? So the exhibition Dark Space that you refer to, Tom McGurk, who's a lecturer in Chester University, he wrote an essay for me. His speciality is drawing. And he wrote an essay, which is online, and he talked about drawing being knowledge creation. And I kind of went, thank you, Tom, you're making it, you're helping me make some sense of this. But I think it's interesting in this university context, which is so much about research and dissemination of information. I think really, this drawing for me really is another form of this. And it's my way of trying to understand and learn about the city that we're all sharing.
Thank you, Dorothy. So our final speaker tonight is Zélie Asava, who is a classifier at the Irish Film Classification Office and also lectures at University College Dublin in film. In 2011, she was awarded the Peter Lang Young Scholars Competition in Irish Studies, which led to the publication of her first book, The Black Irish Onscreen, representing black and mixed race Irish identities on film and TV, which was published in 2013. She has since then more recently published the book Mixed Race Cinema's Multiracial Dynamics in America and France with Bloomsbury. She's also published essays on questions of race, gender and sexuality in Irish, French, American and African cinemas in a range of other publications, and also has also taught film at AIDT and also here at TCD as well. So thank you very much.
Hi everyone. I'd like to speak about racial representations in Irish cinema, obviously focusing on films set in Dublin, but also looking beyond that to consider the industry's approach to ethnic minorities and how that meets or evades real-life experiences. Looking back a little bit, during the so-called Celtic Tiger, Irish cinema became more Dublin-centric than ever, focusing on the city as a space, whereas Trinity's own Ruth Barton notes, the only thing that was culturally distinct was the lack of cultural distinctness. So Dublin was positioned as this very secular, free-thinking, cosmopolitan space, a wealthy, sophisticated, modern first world city. And in filmic terms, it was very much a reaction against the Dublin of Jordan and Sheridan and working class Dublin. So the focus was much more on middle and upper class locals, much more interested in sex and politics. And around this time, while there was that focus on rom-coms and luxury and so on, there were also some films that looked at the flip side of the so-called economic miracle, questioning who it was really benefiting and who was being overlooked. So films like the junkie-centric Adam and Paul, the self-explanatory Pyjama Girls, and Savage, a film that followed a journalist who was mugged, castrated, and then becomes a predator. The most successful film of this period, Once, used the rom-com lightness of the standard Tiger films, but centralised characters marginalised by those films, placing a working-class Dubliner and an immigrant in its lead roles. So the film reflected the changing nature of the city, while utilising familiar Irish exile and impoverished the Flower Girl narratives. NUIG's Tony Tracy compares it to Anthony Cronin's accounts of 1950s Dublin and Sean O'Casey's plays. But despite featuring Phil Lynnott's music and monument and the backdrop of this fast-moving, ever-changing city, it imagined Dublin as an entirely white space, perhaps due to its nostalgic, dreamlike realism, which itself was inspired by 1950s French New Wave cinema. Around this time, there was also the very popular French film Amelie, which again was set in capital city and positioned the city in a similar light, and this nostalgic kind of whitewashing of the city's working classes, but received a much greater backlash for it. As we move towards the present, films like Trafficked, Paddy the Keen, The Front Line, Kisses and Between the Canals have positioned Dublin's black inhabitants as Africans, and mostly as refugees and illegal migrants, vulnerable to or working in conjunction with the city's criminal underworld. So in general, as victims, occasionally as victims who themselves become villains. By contrast, Moore Street Masala looked at how the city could be positively impacted by diversity, in this case turning Moore Street into the backdrop for a rom-com Bollywood musical. Likewise, The Blaxorcist was a fun fusion of Irish comedy and blaxploitation. But since the crash, there have been far fewer films presenting any kind of ethnic diversity, and non-white characters have largely remained stigmatised and isolated. A Day for Mad Mary and You're Ugly Too use European or African foreigners to set a scene rather than move the narrative forward. Cardboard Gangsters, Kissing Candice and Halal Daddy break the norm by featuring black and mixed race characters who are Irish rather than foreigners. But the former two are ghetto narratives, so kind of repeat the old stereotype of the black character being a victim or a villain who is drawn to the underworld. The latter is surprisingly culturally insensitive. There remains a gap between the Ireland we experience and the Ireland that we project to ourselves and to others through our screen media. And when it comes to the capital city, that gap becomes even more pronounced. I think what's fundamental here is the way we want to be perceived versus our reality, and within that, how we sell the city to the rest of the world through our media. The idea of traditional Catholic Ireland may not be very popular at home, but sells well to the Irish diaspora, particularly in America. And the labelling of rural Ireland as a place without technology or diversity is largely a misnomer to Irish consumers, but again, sells well to US markets, hence P.S. I Love You's popularity and various other quaint films. As Fintan O'Toole notes, there is no genuine newness in the so-called New Irish, as Ireland has a history of cultural and ethnic heterogeneity, but, quote, understanding globalisation in the Irish context is as much a task of remembrance as it is of encountering the new. Mixed race and black characters have featured in many Irish films, particularly since the greater influx of migrants in the 90s, but they are often stereotypically cast as lone, troublesome characters, as prostitutes, single mothers, drug dealers, pimps, and so on. They are also usually cast as foreigners, mostly illegal, rather than citizens, and are often used as vehicles to express the otherness of straight white Irish men, as in, for example, The Guard or The Crying Game, where a black or mixed race character is paired with a white male in a semiotic mirroring that visually conveys the exclusion and alienation felt by the white Irish character, who is thus constructed as liminal and oppressed. But we also have some positive narratives, for example, the horror films Isolation and the Dublin set Boy Eats Girl. In these films, the mixed-race character is irrefutably Irish and responsible for saving the nation from an alien invasion. Non-white children have been rare so far in Irish narratives, but Sing Street is one of few to include a black Irish schoolboy in its Dublin 80s setting. So in screen culture as in the socio-political arena, Dublin is often represented through a series of tropes which exclude its non-white citizens, or present the notion that prior to the Tiger there was no ethnic diversity here, which is simply not the case. Whether we consider the well-established Jewish and Italian communities, or the 1940s complaints from the Nigerian government about the treatment of its medical students at universities in the city, Dublin has, like any other capital city, always attracted outsiders. While Celtic Tiger cinema was eager to exploit the capital's diversity, during the recession most filmmakers reverted to the investment-friendly narratives of young white heterosexual men. Even European migrants were absent in these narratives. And while initiatives from the Film Board have led to more female-driven narratives, post-crash cinema is only starting to look outwards again. By contrast, television has produced a series of shows reflective of the Dublin we actually live in, with Women on the Verge presenting a racially integrated cast of alienated middle-class women, and Taken Down looking at the complex issues deriving from the direct provision system and those growing up Irish but other within it. Fair City, despite its drawbacks, has long had an integrated cast representing various Dubliners, whether white or Black Irish, European or African, a shift no doubt due in part to the show's hiring of an African-American writer. Likewise, theatre has seen some important productions looking at Dublin's ethnic others, from the Nigerian reimagining of Synge's Playboy to Ruth Negga's Hamlet, which, due to the casting and stage direction, felt more like Beckett's Dublin than Denmark. UCD's Diane Negra has described the dichotomy underlying Irish identity as a signifier of both an enriched whiteness and an oppressed off-whiteness. Hence Jimmy's famous line in 91's The Commitments, where he, a white working-class musician from Dublin inspired by soul music, collapses colonial discourses to equate his position with James Brown's and declares to his confused friends, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." Yet this film, as with most of its time, absences the Black Irish. One of the main problems with this and other films touching on the topic is that blackness is so often used as a tokenistic identity to shore up ideas of our own victimhood. This erases our own complicity in racism, with very few films presenting characters who experience any kind of abuse or are themselves racist, despite the fact that we have escalating problems in this area. The city's Show Racism and the Red Card events a few weeks ago are a welcome response. To quote the Lord Mayor, "Racism is still a very real problem that we must continue to tackle." Films are needed which address it directly rather than continue with the popular discourse that we can't be racist because we've historically been victims of it. RT's Taken Down is an important milestone in this respect, as it has not only brought to light the extent of racist attitudes through the online discourse the show has generated, but also deals with these issues in its storylines. It features racist language, it features institutional discrimination, and uses these elements to address and critique prejudice, as well as dispelling prejudice through the gradual revelation of its characters' tragic backstories. And it deals with the hyphenated Irish, those Dubliners who are, for example, themselves Nigerian and Irish, both other and us. The sympathetic treatment of a cop who harasses an asylum seeker until he commits suicide, but then quietly transforms into someone who will go above and beyond to find the killer of another asylum seeker housed at the same centre, is a hopeful addition to an otherwise bleak narrative. It may be wildly idealistic, but it also avoids the usual cliches which shut down dialogue about racism and which often reduce the city's inhabitants to a series of melodramatic broad strokes, the victims or the villains. DCU's Debbie Ging writes, "Given the current aversion to self-questioning, it is possible that Ireland will not succeed in developing a truly vibrant and original film output until minority filmmakers gain sufficient confidence to break free of the constraints of positive representation, and until the country's new inhabitants establish a foothold in the culture industries and begin to speak in their own voices, be they migrant, refugee, second generation, hyphenated, naturalised, or diasporic Irish." In the short film Cry Rosa by Afro Mike Productions, which was shown on RTE a few weeks ago, the authentic experiences of a mixed-race Irish woman growing up in Belfast are brought to life. In an all-too-common narrative, she's perceived as African rather than Irish, which, given the media's continued focus on blackness as foreign and tragic, continues to be the case for many young people. The film challenges the collapsing of all types of blackness into one and affirms her Irishness. New RTE comedies Women on the Verge and Finding Joy, as well as the indie rom-com The Randomer, feature mixed and black Irish characters who are part of the normal landscape of Dublin city life. And while Taken Down focuses on members of the subclass, it also creates spaces for Dublin's others to take centre stage as multifaceted agents, both foreigner and local, victim and villain. RTE has been criticised in a new report by the European Broadcasters Union, commissioned by RTE, for being out of touch with its audience and having no discernible interest in or plan for becoming more diverse and inclusive. However, there are clearly positive changes afoot, and as ever, television is leading the way in various strands of programming. Tragic migration is not the only narrative attached to minorities anymore, though it remains dominant. Misrepresentation is just as damaging as underrepresentation, and it's clear that what we need is a media landscape that reflects the diversity of its audience, as complex, nuanced individuals embodying multiple identities, rather than just stereotypes. Colourblind casting is one option, but perhaps we also need to explore colour-focused narratives in order to examine the lived experience of race and racism in today's Dublin. It's clear that we need to address subconscious bias in the industry and look into more representations that recognise the hybrid Irishness so many of us claim and the varieties of identity that Irishness encompasses. Movements towards gender equality have already had a positive effect, with more women working behind the camera than ever, and hopefully this will inspire others to think about equal representation for ethnic minorities as well as LGBT communities and people with disabilities, who are among the many who remain severely underrepresented in our current media landscape. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to invite our three speakers to come and sit here. We've got plenty of time for questions and discussion. And you know, after what I think are three really fascinating contributions. So, do we have any questions? Yeah, of course.
Dorothy, I'm just wondering, who do you think are the intended beneficiaries of change in Ireland today?
Oh. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, to be perfectly honest, I'm going to ask the questions. I don't feel I have, in-depth answers to that, but I just do think, though, that you can see and feel that things are really shifting, into kind of a totally new world than the one that might have been represented by that building of the apartment, the flats in the 50s. So it's kind of a new and unknown space that we're entering. That's really what I feel about it, and I feel kind of anxious and wary about where we're heading.
Is it big business? Or are we in a liminal space, is it? Are we in a kind of a liminal space?
Well, it just seems that private capital has much more power now and it's much more prevalent. It seems to me, but I'm not an economist, and public funding, I don't know what the ratio is, but, there's all the public-private partnerships and the, affordable housing, etc., etc. And like developments down in the in the docks, inner city key area, and the docks, the communities there have to fight really hard, the ISFC and everything like that. And another issue is, like, say, student housing being built. Who are actually the intended beneficiaries of that? It seems to be the students, but I don't think so. And it's certainly not the communities that they're based in.
Would either of you like to comment on that?
I think the beneficiaries are shareholders of companies that are building it. I would, I think we've witnessed one of the biggest capital transfers in history since plantations recently, through NAMA and through the other kind of selling off lock, stock and barrel at bargain basement prices, the whole shebang. So don't get me started with my response to that. But I think the shareholders are calling the shots. And it is, it's the face of global capitalism, and that's what we're seeing. And the communities certainly that I associate with and work with, and who inspire me, and in my own community, where I live out in Baldoyle, the communities are under enormous duress to try and hold on to ideas of community. So I've watched, for instance, I'll give you a very local example. We had a field out the back of our house, kind of a marginal coastal meadow, a lot of wildflowers, and the kids used it as a kind of a decompression zone. They'd have their smokes and their little fires, and we could be teenagers and be a bit wild in a kind of a relatively safe way. That field was traded, the the most enlightening piece of legislation in the history of the state, I believe, was that 20% of all developments be social housing. This was to avoid ghettoisation, which has been one of the features of social housing in the past, and to to encourage mixed community. And so a huge big development up on Claremont Beach in Howth, the development of the old Howth Lodge, the apartments there which go for like up to 600 grand for 2-bedroom apartments. The social housing component of that was not built up at Howth Lodge overlooking the beautiful northern coast with the nice walk up to Howth Village. It was built in the field behind our houses, which are a social housing scheme in the first place. They were so badly built that the roofs had to be replaced twice. This is Fingal County Council. The plumbing had to be dug up a number of times. I mean, we knew as a community that this was disastrous. It was so badly built. You could hear the spurs every morning as the cowboys arrived on site to actually build it. I rang the architect, the chief architect of our municipality, and said, listen, what about regulation? You have to come down and have a look what's going on here. And he asked me, what would somebody living in my estate know about architecture? So where do you go? Like, that's the kind of response communities are getting when they voice real concerns and worries about what's actually happening under their noses. So if you ask me who are the beneficial, who is being ameliorated here, I think it's global capitalism and the shareholders who are the beneficial owners. That's the most cynical view.
I mean, maybe I'll just come in there and say, I suppose this session is to some extent about how you go about representing these things, or how you go about responding to these things, through your respective kind of mediums. So I suppose how, these things are out there, and we know, we kind of know they're there. But how? It's interesting. You both Dorothy and Paula, you both talked about a degree of kind of reticence about being seen to kind of speak on behalf of people, or so. I suppose how do you kind of go about that challenge, or what is it about the way that you're working that is kind of negotiating with that? Trying to represent that. Do you think? That's not too long a question.
I'll just be brief and say, for instance, in that case, which would have oppressed me for years, and then all the money that was spent for private security firms to mind those empty houses that were to be built for families to in the crisis. My way was to write an elegy for the field. The field was lost the morning it becomes a site. So I can only really respond in what's manageable for me. I can't save, alas, I have to draw lines around what I'm able to do. I do try politically as a citizen to be involved and to put my energy there, but in the writing of a poem, I don't know. I just do it and I trust to the world how the poems are used.
Okay, do we have any other questions? There's a microphone coming.
Hello. That's very loud. I'm just curious, when you are writing or drawing or whatever your task is, what we've been talking about just there now, does that come into play, and do you feel that sense of annoyance or anger while you're doing your work? Like when you're drawing, do you feel, when you see those images, do you feel a sense of anger and you draw because of that sometimes, or is it always just about the aesthetic?
No, it's not always just about the aesthetic. It isn't, but the formal qualities are very important. in producing, something like a drawing. I mean, and you can never disregard them. And I am very engaged with the whole form and aesthetic. I don't. I suppose I do feel quite a lot of anger about a lot of stuff about the public realm and the lack of adequate infrastructure. I really do. And I'm involved, like, in Wipster with Reimagining Wipster, which is about addressing that the kind of the built public realm, and we've done a lot of work in that area over the last few years. So yes, I do feel really angry about a lot of things like that. But I suppose that you can't actually feel angry while you're drawing. That's the, so maybe like it's a two-pronged approach. There's a more more activist side to what I do, and then there's that more kind of contemplative side then that produces the drawings that are kind of addressing the same issues, but I don't know, maybe more laterally or something.
Could I ask the other people on the panel to answer the same? Sorry, this is so loud.
I think when I'm writing a poem and involved in a poem, I'm just so full of gratitude that I'm getting anything, that anything's coming through on the airwaves, as it were, that my muse is in my corner. That's what I feel when I'm working, is gratitude. But it is, I mean, a lot of the fueling of my work, and I would say especially when I was younger, the reason I use those two poems is that I suppose one is the beginning of a journey of curiosity in the city when I was a child, and the other one is a kind of completion in that I did get an extraordinary education willy-nilly, and the gratitude I feel for that, for those opportunities with the skills that I acquired to survive in the city to this age. So I just feel gratitude, but the if you like, an energy that propelled me and that kept me focused all through my writing life has been just anger beyond belief. But that's no way to live your life, and I have had to learn ways to integrate what drives me, what I see, the truths I see of people struggling, and the disregard that our rulers often hold the communities in. I've had to find ways that the anger doesn't destroy me, because that's what I've seen in communities, that people internalise anger and pulls them apart, not where it should be directed. So like that, as we've heard, I think you can be an activist with one part of your life and be a creative person who gets great joy and satisfaction and gratitude for the creative life.
Can I just add to that?
Of course.
So I suppose what really does annoy me and get to me is just the disrespect with which people are treated by the state of a lot of the public realm that we inhabit. I mean, I think it's something a lot of people don't question, and a lot of people think, well, it's the way it is, what can you do? But I mean, I'm talking about like really straightforward things, like trying to cycle a bike from A to B, trying to cross the road, like having to negotiate that sheep pen that two prams can't pass by. I just think there's incredible disrespect there that we kind of internalise it, or we certainly have this kind of helpless attitude towards it. And I think sometimes I think, like, why am I so obsessed by this stuff? There's more important things, but maybe it is one of those important things because it affects everybody's everyday life. So it's affecting millions of people every day. So the cumulative effects of this really inadequate infrastructure has, I think, quite profound effects. Now, I might sound like I'm overstating the case here. You can let me know, but that is how I feel about it.
We have another question here, and then there's one at the back as well. So I think this one here first.
One of the things that I thought came through in all the talks was a problem of access and representation. So, Paula, you threw out a statistic or an idea that perhaps this institution was less likely to receive people from that community than a prison. And Zélie, you were bringing up at the end of your talk there, perhaps ideas of what, not necessarily individual films, but the film scene could do. And I wondered how that spoke to the poetry scene and the art scene, rather than the individual act of creation. What can the community do to help respond more properly to the changing city?
I think one of the most obvious problems has been that the industry has felt closed to a lot of people, and there's been a limited number of voices coming through. And as I said, I think that with the film board acknowledging that in terms of gender equality, we've already seen some significant changes. So it's clear that once we recognise there's a problem, there are ways that we can address it in the short term that can have a direct change or produce direct change. I suppose the issue would be that it needs to be thought about in a much broader way. Gender equality is only one of many aspects that need to be addressed. And also, how do you produce long-term change rather than dealing with something in a tokenistic fashion? It seemed that film, for example, had become more diverse in the early 2000s, and that very quickly went away once that kind of image of Dublin or image of the country became unfashionable or unfit for purpose. And there was a kind of looking inward, which is natural in a recession, but I think that it's important that we don't start to use people as a way of selling the country as this kind of image or that kind of image, and rather engage with the reality of the people who live here and their lives, and engage with them as complex individuals. And by addressing things like equality in terms of race and sexuality and disability, then that automatically should occur.
There was a question at the back there.
I'm not really sure it's a question, but I'm sure you don't mind if it isn't. I don't want to misunderstand my friend here when he used the phrase "just the aesthetic," but it's unfortunate that I'm sure he didn't intend it that way. But the phrase is often used dismissively as if art, or the making of art, is an add-on to life. What we sometimes forget is people who commit their lives to making poems, or making music, or making drawings, or making films, are very often doing it because they have one only mortal life, and that's what they're driven to do. The question becomes the mechanisms of support, or inclusion, or exclusion, and I think you have to look at it as a sliding scale. At one end of the scale, there are the non-capital intensive art forms. All Paula needs, all Dot needs, is a pencil and a piece of paper, essentially. When you come to film, for instance, it's very capital intensive. And there are only two streams of capital, public and private. Private wants to maximise the profits for the shareholders. The state funding is determined by a set of gatekeepers. So the question is not one of why is nobody making films that represent the diversity of Ireland? No. The question is, are the gatekeepers alive to the possibilities inherent in opening new streams of capacity, of opening new avenues for imagination? And that then becomes a question of, well, who chooses the gatekeepers? And what values do they espouse? They're almost always, in my long experience of dealing with state agencies of the arts, they're almost always reactive and behind the curve. So I've learned to think of it differently. How do we encourage young filmmakers from whatever background to want to make films? And then how do we construct the mechanisms to support them in doing that? I think often of that moment in the late 1990s when Danny Morrison, he says it wasn't him, but it was Danny Morrison, confronted Seamus Heaney on the train to Belfast and said, when the fuck are you going to write something for us? Meaning something of propaganda value to Sinn Féin. Now that's a very extreme example of the well-meant in some instances, not perhaps in that particular case, the instinct to demand of an artist that he or she represent this, that, or the other topic, theme, subject, or community. I think that's to come at it from the wrong way, because an artist cannot be commanded and shouldn't be commanded. I think we have to start thinking more in terms of how do we construct sets of possibility, how do we construct avenues of access, how do we reach all the way down into the education system and encourage people with a spark of imagination, the drive to commit themselves to the life of an artist. How do we encourage those to have confidence in themselves? How do we tell them that we value what they could contribute? So the difficulty I have constantly is with gatekeepers, always with gatekeepers, whether formally or informally constituted. The fact is that the mentality, the mindset that Seamus Heaney, Maeve McGuckin, Joan Newman, Derek Mann, John Montague constructed by giving witness in their own lives as poets to the complexity of the North, went a great deal to finding healing solutions to those terrible dilemmas. But that was not their intention. We need to learn from history that people take from the art what they need to feed their souls and minds and imagination and their courage. But that has never been achieved by creating regime films, regime poems, regime artworks. We saw the terrible hollowness of what was produced in the former Soviet Union by that kind of mindset. When you have a committee of apparatchiks telling Shostakovich what he may or may not compose. That's not the solution. Elements of that can be recruited to create the solution. The demand for access, for instance, constructing avenues of access. But I think we have to be permanently careful to understand that if Paula Meehan's poems represent the Dublin she grew up in, it is because they are real poems, not because she set out thematically and programmatically to reflect or speak for other people. So I think it's a very interesting, a very fruitful area full of possibilities. But sometimes I think it's necessary to understand that that's how it works.
Thank you very much. So I think there was one more question here at the front. I think,
I'm sure I can follow that. A theme I heard in all your presentations was the tension between memory and reality. That was very clear, I think, in all of your work. And it made me think of this strong movement internationally right now about the vanishing city. So every city you go into, there's like the vanishing Brooklyn, the vanishing Rio, the vanishing London, the vanishing Dublin. And you see it in coffee table books and blogs and film and photo essays, trying to capture a memory of a place that's changing beyond recognition. My question is, are you familiar with this tsunami of a trend about the vanishing city, and do you see your work as participating in it willingly or unwillingly?
I'll just say a couple of things, because I've just finished a project with the Dublin Tenement Museum, number 14 Henrietta Street. I know I watched them demolish in Molesworth Street recently, and I watched them build up with ferocious speed the new temples to Mammon. But the Tenement Museum was one house built by Luke Gardner for Lord and Lady Molesworth, for one family. and it's by the 1911 census, it had 100 people living there in the house. And so it was a fantastic project for me because I grew up in the tenements, so my heart was in it. Otherwise I wouldn't take it on. I wouldn't take on a commission that my heart and soul wasn't in, because it would only lead to bad poetry, of which there's plenty in the world. So I would have to have a really strong emotional draw to that, which I did have. And what I did was, because it was a museum, the word museum originally from the Greek was a place where you put things to please the muses. So I wrote a suite of poems, one to each of the muses, using as much of the historical and archival material that had been gathered in from the last residents, the last people who had lived in it when it was a tenement. There was still a lot of family memory, there was a lot of community memory to the time when it was, you know, the turn of the century into the revolutionary era. Fantastic archival material, but also the spoken memory of people who'd grown up in the tenements, and my own memory, because it was a way of using my own memory. So I don't know if that addresses what you say. My big worry was that I would in somehow normalise tenement living, that it was, you know, Dublin in the rare old times. And I think it's really important to resist that it was horrendous, the lives that people lived. Herbert Sims, when he built all those 1930s, when he designed the 1930s social housing, 17,000 units he designed. He travelled to Vienna, to Antwerp, to Amsterdam, and looked at the best practice in those cities for communities living within the cities. So we have all these beautiful brick and Art Deco flats complexes around the city, and they're only becoming valuable and considered now that they're about to vanish, now that the city council was mooting the idea of demolishing them as not fit for purpose. So suddenly then the scholars who have been amazing, the architectural historians, have come in, and Herbert Sims has been revived as a hero of social housing in the city, with a lot to teach us. So just when something like our music, our traditional music, just when it's about to disappear, there is often a turnaround if we're lucky. Like O'Riordan was born, and he that link really, in a way, just one person was able to turn a juggernaut of obliteration around. So the city is changing, and it's changing so fast, and I mean my own life can't keep up with it, you know, at this end of my life, if you like. So I will continue. I mean, I think poets by their nature work with memory, private memory in this day and age. But I think the new generation, and it feeds back to one of the earlier questions about what is the within the area, what are we doing to encounter these young poets. I started with poets who were 12 and made a great fist of their memories, their poems about childhood memories. But we see them coming through in the Poetry Aloud scheme, which is run by our national poetry organisation, Poetry Ireland, which has a huge and very well considered diversity programme to be as inclusive as possible and to make as many opportunities for children and young people to engage with poetry. So, but poetry by its nature is, in my own experience, has been that the oppression that's given to you or forced on you or put upon you is often your gift. Do you know that without those angers we spoke about, or without the things I saw as a child, I wouldn't be writing poetry. So maybe the retrievals and the salvific elements in the arts are to do around catching a fleeting moment, this present moment, before it vanishes, and in that way trying to chart the rapid change.
Would anyone come in about the Forgotten City? Or?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, it's a fine line though between, you know, there's nostalgia as well, can happen so easily, and you know, it's the thing that cities have always evolved. They've never been static. They've never belonged to any particular group, and you know, in particular, like in the 19th century, the whole, you know, the building of all the suburbs, and people moved out of the city and left the Georgian, you know, the middle classes of the city. So it's constantly, you know, it's always moving. So, you know, there's part of me thinking, you know, trying to hold on to something, you know, that's not the thing to do either. But what really does concern me, though, with what's happening now is that there's another, well, that people can't afford to live in the city, there's another big movement happening of who can actually live in the city and who cannot. And I suppose it's the injustice of that. But I don't think that you can hold on to and make things static. I mean, that doesn't work either.
Thank you. So I think the last question, just at the back there.
It's not really a question. It's just a memory that came up when I was listening to cockles and mussels and stuff like that being collected for people in Dublin. I had a couple of times I've been around Stephen's Green on a tour, looking at all the statues and famous people and the beauty of it and how great it was and what a great attraction they were to this country for people visiting, etc., etc. And it's wonderful. But I couldn't help feeling there's somebody missing that should be in this place. There should be a statue here for this person who was an essential part of Dublin for many, many, many years. And I felt really discrimination. His name was Bang Bang.
Yes.
I don't know if people have heard of Bang Bang.
Yeah. In fact, there's a cafe in
There's a
Wipster.
cafe in
That's
Fittsburg called
Named
Bang Bang.
after him.
Yeah.
I was walking past Trinity here many years ago when I was a child with my mother, and she was pushing the pram, and we'd been out collecting cockles and mussels. And we were walking down to Festival's home, and Bang Bang ran behind her and grabbed her by the hair and said, "Give us a poke." That means give us a kiss. And she turned, but when she turned, he started running. So he's running up Grafton Street and hitting himself like a horse, you know. Bang, bang, you're dead. And everybody is laughing and it's great fun. And people on the buses are leaning out and shooting back. Men dressed in nice suits are going down like that when he's going past, and they're playing shooting like children. But Bang Bang is not remembered there. Why is Bang Bang not in Stephen's Green? I can never understand that. And I've written a story about it in Irish, and a lot of people have come up about it.
He'd be a
This is
performer.
discrimination in its own way, and I know it sounds a bit stupid saying it's discrimination, but it is, in my opinion, discrimination. He was a major part of this city. And most people, when you say Bang Bang, they remember him and his history and his name. But he's not in Stephen's Green. So if anybody would like to set up a big thing, we all go marching for Bang Bang for Stephen's Green.
If we got the statue for every Dublin eccentric, we wouldn't be able to move around.
It would be better than being stuffed by buses.
Well, I think a statue to Dublin, a famous Dublin eccentric, is a great place to finish this session. So I'd like to thank all three of our speakers again for three really fascinating talks.